let's finish off talking about Andrew Jackson by discussing his economic policies in more detail. And again, with that question in mind, to what extent is Andrew Jackson the champion of the common man, or in what ways is he actually expanding the power of the executive branch? So, this actually harkens back to Henry Clay's American system in a lot of ways, because we're still talking about a lot of transportation developments in this historical period. Henry Clay's American system, if you forget, was ultimately an economic policy. Was characterized by things like protective tariffs, a strong centralized bank, and expansion of infrastructure projects such as roads and canals. And so in 1830, there was a construction project already underway in Kentucky. It was called the Maysville Road. It was a highway. And one of the problems that was associated with this road was that it actually was entirely located within one state, just Kentucky. So it wasn't really seen as a, an interstate highway. Unlike a, highway like the five, for example, or if you're on the East Coast, 95, right? So in any case, Maysville Road was only located in one state, and so Andrew Jackson used that as grounds to veto it, right? Because he was arguing that the federal government should not be responsible for the construction of a state road. But some other people say that he also vetoed this because this was sort of, again, this was the project of Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson hated Henry Clay, right? Remember the corrupt bargain. So, to what extent was Jackson doing this based on his own conception of what he thought the economy, how the economy should develop, right, with regard to infrastructure, roads, state power, federal power? And to what extent is Andrew Jackson just trying to get back at Henry Clay? Right? The federal bank, or the Bank of the United States, is arguably the most important element of Jackson's economic policy that you guys need to understand, right? I think it's kind of funny. This is Susan Poger talking about Nicholas Biddle, but I kept it in there because it's kind of funny that it's described as an arrogant aristocrat from Philadelphia. So in any case, this is the Biddle. This is Nicholas Biddle of the Biddle family, a really prominent Philadelphia sort of elite family that owns the building that is the National Bank, right? So the problem with the National Bank, and Andrew Jackson called the National Bank out on this, was that it was quasi privatized, right? Even though the bank housed the federal treasury, the bank survived. Largely because many private wealthy donors also put their money into it, right? And because it was quasi private, I mean, it was helpful because all these wealthy people putting their money into it made sure that currency remained stable, and it also, the money going into it allowed for the growth of the economy, the growth for new financial investments in the country. But nonetheless, this made Andrew Jackson see it as yet another elite institution, right? Something that was sort of, I mean, in a lot of ways, you could see it today as when people reject the power that Wall Street has over the average citizen, right? That's what Andrew Jackson was really getting at, right? He rejected the bank and the power, the centralized power that went along with it, right? The Southerners and Westerners also opposed the bank for that very reason, right? So. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, we remember them, of course, they want the bank to continue, right? So basically, what's happening right now is that the second bank of the United States is it's up for the reissuing of its charter, right? Its charter is about to expire. Andrew Jackson, at the same time, is running for re-election. I'll talk about this in a second, but just listen before I we'll get back to this so we're not confused by the text. Andrew Jackson runs for re-election in 1832. He wins, and actually, when he is running for president, he uses the bank as part of his campaign platform, right? He will allow the bank charter to expire if he is reelected. And again, he uses that sort of elitist notion of the bank in order to justify this. One of the oppositions to the bank is also based on the conception of currency, right? So you're actually seeing that there's an opposition to whether people's currency or money is based on hard currency, right? Things like gold and silver, right? Which is also called specie, or soft money, which is paper currency, right? And as you can see here, right, state bankers, right, more local bankers actually were opposed to soft money um, because, actually, rather, in any case, sorry, I'm speaking backwards. People who supported soft money, right, actually believe that it would be more of a boon to economic expansion because it would be easier for banks to loan out money if they could just print it, right? And also, they believe that land speculation would be much easier if you had paper currency, right? It would just be easier to have access to money, right? Of course, you guys are probably thinking in the back of your heads the problems such as inflation that could result from this. Okay, and then people who backed hard currency believe that you needed to be safe, right? That your money had to actually be backed in some sort of actual hard currency, right? Something like gold, something like silver. People that supported hard currency believed that paper currency was meaningless. It didn't have any value, right? And they also believed that too much economic expansion, too much economic speculation, too many banks issuing too many loans was dangerous. Right. But nonetheless, Andrew Jackson gets his way. When he is elected in 1832, he allows the bank charter to expire, or rather, he vetoes the continuation of the bank's charter, right? And then the money that was formerly in the Bank of the United States gets redeposited into state banks. These are nicknamed pet banks because many of these banks have cronyistic relationships with Andrew Jackson and his associates, right? And so they also stand to benefit financially from these arrangements. In 1836, the charter officially expired, and by 1841, the bank was completely bankrupt. And we're going to see that also as a result of all of this, by the time 1841 rolls around, by the way, Andrew Jackson is no longer president, right? But nonetheless, we're seeing the ramifications of the end of the bank leading, or rather, continuing far after Jackson has left office, right? In any case, the reason why the bank was an election issue was, again, partially because Jackson actually associated a lot of the corruption surrounding the renewal of the bank around the Biddle family specifically. So we sort of use the Biddle family as an example of the corrupt, a wealthy elite, right? Biddle and his associates with the bank preferred their relationship with Henry Clay because Henry Clay supported a strong national bank, and this obviously is problematic for Jackson as well because, as we've already established, Andrew Jackson hates Henry Clay, right? So in any case, Jackson actually sort of takes a personal vendetta against the bank, against Henry Clay, and against the Biddle family by saying the bank, translation, the Biddles, and Clay, is trying to destroy me, but I will destroy it, right? Nonetheless, I said this earlier, but at this point, also Jackson is running for re-election, right? We've talked about this quite a bit already, but John C. Calhoun, largely as a result of the tension between these two men with the nullification crisis, right? John C. Calhoun drops out of the, or actually Jackson drops him rather, but John C. Calhoun is so upset, right, with Andrew Jackson and vice versa that John C. Calhoun no longer is Jackson's running mate in 1932, or sorry, 1832 rather, and instead, Andrew Jackson, good grief. Andrew Jackson picks up Martin Van Buren as his running mate in his second bid for president. At this point, also, you see that there's an opposition party to Jackson that is rising. It's called the Whig Party. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but the Whig Party never really rises to the ranks of a true challenger to Jackson. And as you probably know in history, we only have a handful really of Whig presidents, and even those guys are not truly Whigs, right? And we all know William Henry Harrison doesn't really count, right? Haha, sorry, bad joke. In any case, both of these parties, in a lot of ways, are experiencing weaknesses, right? The Jacksonian Party formed partially as an opposition party to the Democratic Republicans, and then the Whig Party subsequently forms as an opposition party to the Jacksonians. So you can't really have a strong party coalition when the only thing that you all agree on is what you hate, right? That tends not to work, right? So in any case, like, okay, just giving a modern example, right? You can't say the Democratic Party is not going to fix itself magically by just all hating Donald Trump at the same time, right? They have to figure out something else that's going to bring them together, right? This political cartoon is one of the more famous ones representing Andrew Jackson, right? This is clearly, at least I hope we could see by looking at this, that this is clearly a cartoon that is created by a Jackson opponent, right? Jackson is dressed up like an English king here. He is standing on a torn up copy of the Constitution. He is also standing on top of a torn up copy of Henry Clay's American System. It reads internal improvements. It reads U.S. Bank. So he's tearing up both of these documents, right? He is holding a veto in his hand, right? Born to command, a veto memory. King Andrew the First, had I been consulted, right? So all very much pointing to the idea that Andrew Jackson was expanding the powers of the executive branch to something that was beyond what it was designed to be. Right. So in 1832, right, again, we saw this opposition party emerge, right? The Whig Party was largely a party that was uh, against Jackson. That's really the major thing that solidified them together. But some of their other policies that they tended to all rally around was the idea that they weren't as concerned with some of the socioeconomic disparities in the country as much as the Democrats were, right? So again, you could see how the Whigs might represent more of a sense of elitism. They also wanted the federal government to still be able to regulate the economy. They didn't like. We don't really talk about laissez-faire economics yet. That's more of a 20th century term, but nonetheless, if that existed, the Whigs were opposed to it, right? They believed that the federal government should be really powerful because they believed that state governments, when left to their own devices, and just regular individuals, when left to their own devices, would result in more of a chaotic or anarchistic even role. The Whigs did not believe that Indian removal should take place. It's not written down here, but the Whigs also tend to be very opposed to westward expansion, and they were devastated when the National Bank was killed, and they also wanted tariffs to remain intact. And then by contrast, the Democrats, we talked about a lot of these guys already, or a lot of these characteristics already, but again, I would just pause this without me babbling on too much. I don't want this video to be much longer than the others, so just take note of the different political issues surrounding these two parties. In 1832, we see Jackson winning by an even wider margin, right? So he wins solidly the electoral vote, impressively. One could call this a landslide, and a pretty significant, not a landslide victory with the popular vote, but a significant one nonetheless, right? And so one of the reasons why this is because with the Whig challenger, you're not really going to see any one strong candidate rally behind the opposition to Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay is never going to be successful enough to be able to defeat Andrew Jackson. In any case, let's just talk about, let's just finish up this era. I know that this is the age of Jackson, but I want to just talk about Martin Van Buren's presidency in this era, because Martin Van Buren was a one-term president and seen as arguably riding off the coattails of Andrew Jackson, but he fails in doing this because the economy starts to fail. Right. So Martin Van Buren, you can see again a pretty significant electoral victory, largely because he won Andrew Jackson's endorsement very handily. Right. Andrew Jackson basically argued that a vote for Martin Van Buren would be a vote for the continuity of Jackson's accomplishments. Right. So he wins very handily there. And actually, when Jackson is still president, before he leaves office, the issue of currency is going to be ultimately what results in the destruction of Martin Van Buren's reputation. So, nonetheless, the Specie Circular was an act that ultimately attempted to modify currency in the United States. Andrew Jackson was very distrusting of paper currency. Right, he did not support over speculation of real estate. He did not believe that banks should be issuing so many loans, way too much credit. He believed that ultimately the sole form of currency should be one that was backed in specie, right? One that was backed in either gold or silver. And so the Specie Circular basically required that federal land, right, for speculation could only be purchased with either gold or silver, not paper currency anymore, right? And despite the fact that this might have been a smart move in a lot of ways, because paper currency was in many ways irresponsible, it was done so suddenly that it shook the economy and made it incredibly unstable. Banks were forced to recall many of their loans, and many overzealous speculators didn't actually have that money, right? They had spent it on other purchases. And so many banks were forced to close their doors. Many investors in these banks lost their investments, right? There was no such thing as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? So people didn't have their deposits protected in the bank. If a bank failed, people's money just disappeared, right? So Jackson's goal may have been benevolent, but the results of the Specie Circular were very destructive, right? So we're going to see inflation skyrocket. We're going to see land sales plummet because banks aren't able to issue loans anymore. People can't get the money they need to actually purchase land to begin with. Um, You're going to see that again. That goes along with credit not being available, right? Other businesses, banks, and then businesses that require on loans from banks are also forced to close their doors. And because so many businesses fail, many people are out of the job. So unemployment is as high as 25% in certain parts of the country, which rivals that of the Great Depression, right? So this was called the Panic of 1837. It was not a financial depression, but it was a financial recession. But by the time it set in, Andrew Jackson wasn't president anymore, right? Martin Van Buren took office in 1837, so he gets the nickname Martin Van Ruin because people tend to blame the person who's in the White House for their economic problems. So, despite the fact that this was all set up, arguably, from Andrew Jackson's presidency, Martin Van Buren takes the blame. Martin Van Buren is a one term president, and we'll see what happens when the 1840 election rolls around. Right? This is just a cartoon demonstrating the extent to which the Panic of 1837 hits the entire population, not just the wealthy, right? And this is another reason why, of course, uh, Martin Van Buren is voted out of office and William Henry Harrison is voted in. Andrew Jackson ends up retiring after he leaves office, right? And he dies in 1845. So he will not live to see the Civil War, but he will live into a time when sectional division is becoming that much more tense, right? And so just bringing us back to the very beginning, the question we asked in the very first video, right? And I will leave this question to you. It would be unfair of me to indoctrinate you with my own opinion, but the question is, right? To what extent is Andrew Jackson the champion of the common man? Or to what extent is he trying to act like a monarch, a dictator, an autocrat? You choose your words, right? But this is a really important takeaway question, and in the grand scheme of things, we have to think about how Andrew Jackson's presidency shapes our understanding of U.S. presidents as a whole. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll pick up with some videos on Manifest Destiny soon. Thanks.